In the last two historical lectures, we were pretty much looking at the technological advances that happened during the Industrial Revolution with printing because of the steam engine automating things, and then with photography as chemistry and photographic processes allowed us to do so. Now, in this lecture, I want to look at some of the actual design trends that were going on during the Industrial Revolution. A lot of these trends had to do with the ability that the technological developments gave people. The other thing that happened that was huge was people moved out of the farms and into cities. As the steam engines created more and more powerful machines, farming could be done more easily, didn't take as many people, and the jobs shifted into the factories in the cities. That, along with the more easy spread of information with printed material, so the spread of knowledge again, the ease of access to newspapers and things like that, completely changed what people were getting from their printed material and how many people were getting it and what companies were doing with their printed material now. So two things came together almost immediately when you get cities is one, there's just more of a cluster of people, and so to get people's attention you have to stand out a little bit more. And you'll see this is a perfect photograph here, where on the buildings now we have these gigantic billboards that are advertising things. The other thing that's happening is companies are doing more advertising. They're able to mass produce objects now, and so you can get corporations, large companies mass producing objects and selling them in a more standardly consumerist fashion like our society is now, rather than a society that's ruled by royalty. You now have a society that's more ruled by the company. So that immediately leads to this thing in typography where you have to have big, thick type, fancy type to catch people's attention. And in America, to print this large as they're doing, pretty much anywhere, sorry, not just in America, but to print as large as they're printing here, you couldn't use those iron types, so they were using wood block cuts. They were going back, and the fonts that came out of that were much thicker, and people were also getting fancier with them because they were larger. They could do more with the details in them. So this is 1835. At this point, there was also industrial foundries, so they would print these off in these big foundries, and then you could buy these typefaces and make posters with them. One of the things that was happening in poster design, beyond them just being big and attention grabbing, is because people had a number of those sets of letters from the foundries, when they were putting together their reliefs to print the posters, they were more concerned about how everything fit on there than they were about consistency of typeface across it. So they would just grab, well, this one stands out and it fits in that area, and then we can put the print here, and then this one fits there, and we need these ones to be small. So you get really this eclectic mix of typefaces, or what we would now call fonts. We'll continue to call them typefaces though. We didn't really have in the Western world good color woodblock printing for a lot of it, but you do see sometimes where people would make multiple woodblocks, and like in this example here from Harold and Sons Typography, you would get these fonts that involve multiple colors as well, and you can see these are wooden letter poster block cutters. Something else that happened with the printing presses being able to print more and more and more copies of stuff is newspapers became more popular, and then the actual like thick printed magazine became a thing for the first time. So one of the very first magazines that was published regularly on a monthly basis, like we would think about a magazine now, was Harper's Monthly magazine, and it was 100 some odd page publication, where before you would only get the broadsheets that were like folded in half, maybe would be as big as they were. In these magazines, they were able to collect mostly literature, but also articles. Here you have the latest fashions for the winter. What that did is it made sure everyone was getting the same type of information. So now the democratization process reverses a little bit. Even though we have in 1888 with the Kodak camera, there's this thing where everyone can be part of the process. For the most part, people, until the invention of the internet, are still locked out of contributing to the public record. Now the large companies have taken hold of the printing presses, and so they decide what gets printed, and they're in control of the narrative, and they start to use it for advertising purposes, and to build common narratives and common stories. So you'll see in the magazines, they'll have these articles about the fashion for the winters. You also get in 1875, for the first time, N.W. Ayer and Son create the first advertising agency. People had bought and made ads in magazines and broadsheets and things like that before, but an advertising agency provided the entire package. So they would provide all the writing for you, they would provide the typesetting, they would have someone make the illustration you need, and then they would coordinate with the different newspapers and magazines to have your ad placed as well. So advertisement became a much bigger thing. I put this one in here. This is from a little bit later on, but I just think this one is funny because it goes with this idea of beauty standards, as we have like more public idea of what beauty means, and it's a toilet mask. So this was some mask that they put on their face to try and keep their skin smooth. In Harper's, they would have illustrators contribute these pictures to their stories. One of the most famous people is Charles Dana Gibson, who's very famous for his Gibson Girl, and this is an early example of society starting. It's not that we never had beauty standards before, but mass-produced beauty standards in a magazine of fashion and what men and women should look like. So you see he's doing very handsome fellows and very pretty ladies in their nice dresses, and that's being mass distributed. Also, Thomas Nast, who worked for Harper's, came up with basically what became the political cartoon. He's the great-grandfather of the political cartoon. So he was combining words and pictures, also a predecessor to comic books, where the words and the pictures come together to make a political point or tell a story. He was someone who also contributed to our general public iconography in America and in the Western world. As pretty much everyone was reading the magazine, we could now come up with symbols that we all latched onto and understood what they meant. So he came up with the donkey for the Democratic Party and the elephant for the Republican Party. He came up with the figure of Uncle Sam. He came up with the basic look of the red and white clothed Santa with the big beard. Those are all images that he introduced, along with many others. So he started to set a standard iconographic vocabulary for America especially. Now, anytime there's a movement, like in this case, there's a movement in society towards mechanization, where things are done by large firms, where one person does the writing, one person does the drawing, one person does the typeface, and it's kind of crudely and poorly printed and just get it out there quick and cheap. There's going to be a counter reaction to that. So sometime around 1883, you got what was called the arts and craft movement, and this was a trend. William Morris was the main artist behind it, and there were some writers and things as well. And the idea there was that in industrializing, humankind had lost the handicraft and the love and the dedication and the spirit of art. It had just become mass production. And so this movement was people who wanted to, like, it was basically like the do-it-yourself type of movement that we've seen in the 2000s as well. So here's a piece of fabric design, a pattern that then got, you can see it's like stitched into the fabric. This is a William Morris design. They were very interested in looking back at the Renaissance era when people were hand printing books and hand carving. There was the Century Guild, which was a group of people. Also, you had people that were mad they were losing their jobs, right? I talked about with the linotype machine, you had one person could now do 700, 800 people's jobs. There were skilled craftspeople who still appreciated their craft, and they would form these guilds, where they were trying to find other ways to use their skills. So this magazine, Hobby Horse, was part of the movement. They would release this, I don't want to call it a zine, but that more like a self-published type of book, just for a select few people who are interested. William Morris then got together with the illustrator Walter Crane, and they formed Kelmscott Books. This is one of the prime examples of arts and crafts movement production. This book, The Works of Geoffrey Chaucer. So this is all hand carved. They still use typefaces. It's not like they carved the entire thing over and over. So these leaf designs and things would be repeated, but they were carving out the reliefs and hand setting the whole thing themselves. Hand carving. Here's another page from it. William Crane was producing the woodcuts for it, or the etchings for it, and then they were printing them in limited runs all themselves. And they were trying to come back to this idea of craftsmanship and art in production. The other thing that they introduced to the art world, really, and the design world overall, is the sense that the entire product should be one piece of art. So this book, the whole book is a piece of art and a piece of design that's considered how every page relates to every other page, relates to the cover. That wasn't something that people had really talked about before, and that's a very important idea moving forward into the 1900s. This guy, Walter Crane, also earlier in 1874, was one of the first people to do a book for children. There hadn't been books printed for children before, and so you see here from 1874 the Absurd ABC. And he starts to set up, again, some of these ideas that we see later in magazines and comics and modern kids' books, where the words are often little captions, and they're more related to the pictures. The words are inside of the picture, and there's pictures inside of the word. They mix and jumble up a little bit more in his book. And that's a pretty big innovation. Normally you would get the words and the pictures separated. So remember, we started with words and pictures, kind of words turning into pictures, pictures turning into words a long time ago, 70,000 years ago or something. We started that process, and then they stayed separated, and now people are starting to put them back together. This type of work that he's doing here has a few earlier precedents that we need to look at now. So we're going to jump back to 1793 and look at the Englishman William Blake, who was either a total genius or a bit of a nut job, or probably both. But he claimed to have received information from angels, and he wrote all these poetries and did all the illustrations and made these books that had to do with the visions that he saw. What he did is he did hand-colored etching. So he did an etching and then would print off a limited edition run of his books, and then him and his wife would hand-color each edition. You'll see that Blake, because of that hand etching that he was doing, he was combining his words and his pictures together in a way that didn't show back up until almost 100 years later with Crane. And he was also doing this colored line work, which you don't really see again until someone like Crane, because remember, the color lithography needed to develop, and or people had to figure out how to print off with multiple wood blocks, which an advertising that was just trying to get a book out quick, a company that was making magazines, not interested in that kind of artistry. Now, the other thing we need to look at is the influence of Japanese colored wood blocks. So here's a very early one by Morinobu Hishikawa. He was one of the earliest inventors or greatest early artists with the Japanese wood block. At his time, any of the coloring would have been hand colored, like William Blake. So that's 1680. And remember, a wood block is anything that's in black was raised up like a stamp, and then they were printing it. By the time you get to Suzuki Hironobu in 1766, the Japanese had figured out how to make multiple wood blocks, and then each block would represent a different color, and they had a process to line them up. So now you could repeat the colors exactly the same every time. That tradition continues on. Hokusai is one of the all-time most famous of these artists. He's much later, in 1830. And here you see the suspension bridge on the border of Hida and Echu provinces. He's considered one of the great masters. There's a number of these great artists. What happened is there was a period in Japan called Sakoku, and it literally means closed country. and this was from about 1633 to 1853, where Japan didn't have any interaction with the outside world. So all of this artistry was pretty much lost to the West. No one was seeing it happen. In 1853, an American naval commander, Matthew Perry, went over to Japan and basically forced them to start trading with the West again. As soon as that happened, we got exposed to their woodblock prints, and artists and designers went crazy because it's beautiful stuff. So this like clean black line with flat colors or colors with minimal gradients became hugely influential in the Western design and art world. Something else that happened that contributed to the changes is with this public advertising, these posters that were all over trying to get people's attention as they moved into the big cities. The limitations on what could be put on the posters loosened. In 1881 in France, the censorship laws changed that allowed a more variety of posters and also allowed just more posters to be put up in general. And one of the early artists that took advantage of that was a fellow named Jules Charest, and this is a good example of one of his posters. This one's a little later, but he started almost immediately after 1881 producing posters like this. He led to an entire movement of art called Art Nouveau, which literally means the new art, and you'll see artists like Alphonse Mucha is probably if you think Art Nouveau, this is what you think of, where there's all these long, beautiful, flowing, curvy lines that are kind of taken from like vines and flowers, and this is like what blew up in terms of the poster art that was all over France that was catching people's attention. And then everyone loved the style. It soon spread all over the world. And there's tons of artists that contribute to this that we could look at. But you can see Mucha took also that Japanese woodblock thing with these strong lines, filling them with colors. And these were lithographs, so color lithographs that were being printed. Remember that lithograph technology brought to the West the ability to get these color prints. So those two influences come together. That style goes in a few directions. Some people focus more on the design and the packing of detail. And you can see this is related actually to the arts and crafts movement still. They're still picking up on some of the design trends from here, but starting to simplify them a little bit. So someone like Mucha is still focused on the flowery patterns and the beauty of it. Someone like Toulouse-Lautrec was more interested in the big, simple graphic impact of the poster on the street. So Toulouse-Lautrec starts simplifying shapes, putting these big flat areas of black against white against yellow to try and make a very attention-grabbing thing. You can see that the lettering simplifies. So he is pushing that Art Nouveau in a different direction. You see here Will Carqueville with his Lippincott poster is more in the simple vein. Very simple primary colors, black like a little skin color for this poster for Lippincott's monthly magazine. So here you see the poster design and the magazine design coming together. This actually is a good premonition of what magazine covers would look like in current times, but back then you could see that's what a magazine cover still looked like. An interesting one that I found was this piece by Henri Van de Velde from 1899. It was for a company called Tropon, or a product called Tropon that made a powdered food concentrate. You can see here that design is now moving away from pictorial representation. It's gotten so simple, it's just about shapes and letters now. It's an abstract thing. So early abstraction starts in right at the beginning of the 1900s, right at the end of the 1800s in design. Koloman Moser and a group of other artists were printing another one of these small do-it-yourself magazines called Ver Sacrum. So you can see he's got that same Alphonse Mucha flowery inspiration, but again simplifying more. They were always printing in this square format, so you can see how this is now later on influenced album art covers. You're probably familiar with this stuff, and we'll see it again in the rock and roll album covers and posters. Inside the magazine, they were really playing around quite a bit. They were doing all kinds of interesting experiments with pattern, the relationship between the words and the patterns, having color in there. They were printing things in gold ink on transparent papers, white ink on white ink, embossing, playing with different paper types. So they were really playing with the book as a piece of art in itself. As this Art Nouveau revolution went and spread to other countries, people started making slight changes to it. So you'll see this piece here by Charles Rennie Mackintosh, the Scottish musical review poster, starts moving towards what would eventually become called Art Deco, where the patterns now become a little bit more geometric, straight with circles, and all very tall like this. That's what Art Deco turns into. So it's taking that Art Nouveau thing and putting it more on a grid, basically. The tall length of the posters like this, if you think back to that first image I showed of the buildings, these things are now conforming to the height of buildings as well. So you get this interest in these tall vertical compositions. This piece by Adolf Bohm goes for pure abstraction. There's no picture at all. It's just design and letters. So that's a really interesting early innovation here in poster design that's going to carry on into all of the other stuff that we look at later on. This interest in pattern and abstraction really flourished in the Netherlands with the Dutch. So there was again, remember this idea of something happens and then people react against it. With the Art Nouveau and with the arts and craft movement, you get all that really flowery stuff, or you get this very detailed, like cluttered stuff. People reacted against that and wanted something simple and clean and austere looking. And the Dutch pretty much led that. And you'll still see it in like IKEA, that the places from those areas, the Nordic countries, tend to produce cleaner stuff. So this is a piece of educational material that an artist and educator named J.L. Mathieu made. It was instructions of how to compose around these geometric ideas. So he was showing different ways to break up a square and a circle with these like logical patterns to come up with compositions. Another thing that happened at that time, 1898 to 1906, is people started trying to come up with identities for their corporations and for their artwork. So here's a font typeface, a font family, a font identity. Typeface family is what they're called technically. This is the Berthold Accidents Grotesque font. And what they mean by a font family is that, and you are all used to this now, you have like regular, bold, italic, black, thick, and then it's also at different sizes. And this lets someone like design a book that has these different, I can have a bold, I can have an italic, but they're all still invented to go together. So people were interested in these identities. And remember that a lot of that has to come from the companies now want to have solid identities. So Peter Behrens, who was a student of Mathieu, someone who followed his work, was the first like corporate industrial designer who was coming up with corporate identities for people. He innovated that idea of like an identity system. So he would come up with like, here's for AEG, it was an electric company in Germany that was producing electric products. He came up with their corporate logo. So now you have the corporate logo, which is a piece of typesetting, font design, and the actual like design that fits into, like we did with ours. Then he would come up with, if they did printed material, there was certain like grids that they would fit to. There was these one like going to be black and white with one color. They were going to have these type of patterns on them, these framed off pieces like this, where anytime you saw something from this company, you would immediately kind of understand you were dealing with one of their product. He also innovated like product design, where you could have what are called modular products, or the sense of like choice. So there's one pot that you could buy, same designer, same company, the electric company, but you could get the pot in like a matte finish in like silver. You could get it in this flocked finish in bronze. You could get a tin finish that's more shiny. you could have like little different lids, and there was I believe 30 different components that you could kind of switch around. So the company could now mass produce something, but have people also feel like they were personalizing their items a little bit. And that was a huge innovation to sell people things, because you want people to feel like they have a choice, but really you're not giving them much of a choice. It's the same thing over and over. But if you like bronze and you like tin, then you can have your way, but you're still buying the company's product. So Behring contributed that idea along with the idea of corporate identity. And then in book design, in the Netherlands, the Dutch book design and typography went for these very simple, very clear, very easy to read type of book designs. It was a total reaction against what people were doing, like with the arts and crafts movement. And they wanted them to be beautiful, not just these hacked out like productions like you would get from most people just publishing a paperback book. They would be beautiful and well and thoughtfully designed, but they'd be very simple and very clear. And these guys were also really focusing on designing the typefaces to be clear and legible and nice fonts. Over in America, you get artists like the architect Frank Lloyd Wright that was picking up on all of this design and bringing that into his work. And then finally for this lecture, the man who invented the term graphic design was a typeface designer, a graphic designer named William Dwiggins. Sorry, I have William Gowdy up here. That's a mistake. William Dwiggins in 1922. He worked for a guy named Frederick Gowdy. He also designed the typeface Caledonia, which you should all still be able to probably get a hold of in the programs that you use. So he was the one, like I said at the very beginning of this class, who talked about people who design these types of things. He calls them graphic designers.